Welcome back for lecture number 2. Today we'll talk about the second chapter from Franklin's book, where he's still doing some setup. But the next chapter, I promise, we'll get to some specific detailed arguments. But bear with me. So in part 1, we'll be talking about what it means to be accountable for an action. But first, let's start with an overview of Franklin's larger argument. So Franklin wants to defend libertarianism about free will. And to do that, he needs to do two things. First, he needs to show that free will is incompatible with determinism. And second, he needs to show that free will is compatible with indeterminism. And so the second chapter of Franklin's book, our current chapter, gives the first part of his argument for why free will is incompatible with determinism. So how does that argument go? So Franklin wants to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, and he does that by trying to show that moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. Because as we've seen last time, Franklin assumes that free will and moral responsibility go hand in hand. But how do you argue for this incompatibility? So one thing you could do is you could invite the reader to imagine a world in which determinism is true, and then you could try to argue directly that this person in this deterministic world, where each one of her actions is an inevitable consequence of what happens earlier, doesn't have any moral responsibility for whatever she does. And that might convince some people, but someone who's already committed to compatibilism, someone who already thinks that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility, probably won't be very impressed by that argument. So Franklin's argument is more indirect. And so Franklin's strategy is to consider certain conditions of which everybody uncontroversially already thinks that they remove or diminish moral responsibility for an outcome. These are factors like being insane, being a psychopath, not intending the bad outcome, or acting under the influence of addiction. So these are the kinds of things where we ordinarily believe that if a person is subject to them, then that person is not fully morally responsible for what they do. Franklin's strategy then is to ask, why exactly do these conditions remove or diminish moral responsibility? For example, what exactly is it about insanity such that if a person is insane, he or she is not fully morally responsible for their actions? So he looks at the kinds of conditions where we ordinarily believe that these conditions remove or diminish moral responsibility. And the final step of Franklin's argument is then to show that determinism is covered under these conditions. So he's trying to convince you that if you accept that these conditions here diminish moral responsibility, then you also have to accept that determinism removes moral responsibility, because determinism, the same factors are in place in both cases. So here's another way of illustrating Franklin's argumentative strategy that I think is even clearer. So first, we look at circumstances where it is uncontroversial that an agent is not morally responsible for doing something wrong, and then we ask precisely why in each of these circumstances the agent is not morally responsible. So we will end up asking questions such as the following. Why are psychopaths not morally responsible? Or why are addicts not morally responsible? Or why are people who did not intend the bad outcome not morally responsible? And based on these data, which are all cases where an agent is not morally responsible for something bad they did, we are then trying to extract general conditions that make it that an agent is not morally responsible. And so we arrive at a theory of moral responsibility that might tell us, for example, an agent is not morally responsible if either condition X is satisfied, condition Y is satisfied, or condition Z is satisfied. And Franklin's argumentative move is then to show that determinism falls precisely under one of these conditions. And so this argumentative strategy is brilliant because Franklin starts from conditions where everybody, regardless of their larger stance about the free will question, accepts that they do diminish moral responsibility. And then he tries to convince you that if you think that these factors diminish moral responsibility, and that's something that pretty much everyone believes, then you also ought to believe that determinism removes moral responsibility because the same factors are in play in both cases. So I think that's a really, really cool argument, and let's follow the argument along. So as just seen, Franklin's argument requires us to look more closely at our ordinary practice of when we hold people morally responsible for an action. And here Peter Strawson, in a famous article, introduces the notion of a reactive attitude. And so what's a reactive attitude? So suppose someone does something bad. For example, someone destroys your favorite vase, which you had inherited from your deceased grandmother. And if someone does something very bad, it's then very natural for us to react with distinctive kinds of judgments and emotions, which may be more or less severe. And when we engage in these judgments and emotions which we have in response to someone having done something bad, then in doing that we hold the person morally responsible. My emotions and my judgments express that the person did something wrong for which they are responsible for. And of course, the same can happen when someone does something good, such as taking great risks to save a cat. Then we also react with distinctive judgments and emotions. They're just different judgments and emotions, which express praise rather than blame. And it's central for Franklin's argument that sometimes when someone does something bad, there can be certain extenuating circumstances that get that person off the hook, in the sense that if these circumstances obtain, then despite the person having done something bad, it still wouldn't be appropriate to blame them for it. For example, suppose the person who shattered your favorite vase credibly explains to you that they didn't actually mean to do it, it was just an accident, or they explain to you that doing so was somehow out of their control because they had a panic attack, or you somehow come to realize that they had no idea that they did something wrong. These cases would convince you that you're not justified at getting angry and blaming the person after all. And Franklin calls such extenuating circumstances pleas. And so Franklin's central question is whether determinism is such an extenuating circumstances. Is determinism the kind of condition that gets you off the hook, such that if you did something bad, but your action was determined by earlier conditions because our universe is deterministic, does that mean that it would be inappropriate to blame you for the bad thing you did? So that's what Franklin is interested in. And before I talk more about this, it's worth noticing that Franklin in his methodology has replaced the question of when is somebody morally responsible with the question when it is appropriate to praise or blame somebody. And that replacement makes sense because the latter question is more feasible, because rather asking us a very abstract question about the notion of moral responsibility, we now talk about the practice of praising or blaming people, which is something that we are all familiar with because we do it all the time. And so the next step in Franklin's argument is now to give a systematic theory of how exactly it can come about that a person is not morally responsible for performing something, a bad action. So when exactly is it the case that it's not appropriate to blame someone even though they did something wrong? But before he gets to that question, Franklin introduces some terminology. He specifies the exact kind of moral responsibility that he's interested in, and he calls that kind of moral responsibility moral accountability. The details here will not concern us. The basic idea is what I just said earlier. Moral accountability is such that you're morally accountable for an action just in case you deserve blame if the action was bad, and you deserve praise if the action was good. And we will focus on the case where the action is bad. So the question is, how exactly can it happen that someone doesn't deserve blame even though they did something bad? And to get us started, imagine the following case. You just got back from a long trip, you were away from a really long time, and you had a long flight. You finally got off the plane and arrived at the airport, and you're really excited to get back. You're really tired, and you're really looking forward to sleeping in your own bed. And luckily, a friend promised to pick you up from the airport, but the problem is just that that friend never shows up, and despite calling him several times, you can't get a hold of that person. And so you find yourself stranded at the airport, and you get increasingly irritated. And now think about what could make it that despite all this, you still wouldn't blame your friend for not having picked you up. You still wouldn't blame your friend for not showing up at the airport. And Franklin argues that there are three different classes of pleas, where each one would explain why your friend is not to blame. And the first kind of plea is justification. It could turn out that your friend actually did nothing wrong. For example, it could be that your friend actually was on his way to pick you up. It was just that on his way to picking you up, he came across some traffic accident, and so he stopped to see whether he could help at the accident. Given these circumstances, not picking you up wasn't anything morally bad, and so he would be justified and so not to blame. The second plea is what Franklin calls an excuse, and that occurs if your friend in this particular case, in this particular one instance, just wasn't in a condition that would make him morally accountable for anything. For example, suppose that earlier that day, someone abducted your friend and hypnotized him, instilling in him a strong fear of airports. And given that the friend had this strong fear of airport, it seems it would just be wrong to hold him morally accountable for not showing up. And that would be what Franklin calls an excuse. Your person is resolved in that particular case from moral accountability, either completely if the excuse is exculpatory, or partially if the excuse is mitigating. And the third plea is what Franklin calls exemption, and that is, it could turn out that your friend is simply in general not the kind of person that ever can be morally accountable for anything. For example, it might turn out that your friend has some severe psychological condition that makes it impossible for him to ever act in a reasonable way. And depending on the condition, your friend might then either be completely or partially absolved for ever being morally accountable for his behavior. And so we are mainly interested in the second and third kind of plea, excuse and exemption, where a person is not, or at least not fully morally accountable despite having done something wrong. And the question is then, what exactly explains why in each of these cases the agent is not morally accountable? For example, why exactly is it that addicts or psychopaths are excused or exempt from moral responsibility? And we will talk about that in the second part of the lecture. I'll see you then.